In the late summer of 1883, in a prospector's encampment along the cracked and colorless flats of the Gila Basin in Arizona Territory, a young woman named Vera Kraus walked out to a dry riverbed at first light and did not come back until the sun had begun to lean toward the western ridgeline. The air was hot and still, as it was every morning in August in that country, and the flat ground between the camp and the channel was pale with alkali dust that clung to boots and the hems of skirts and settled back to the earth only when the wind came up in the late afternoon. She walked without hurrying. She carried her sieves under one arm and her iron rod in her other hand, and anyone who watched her go would have seen a woman who knew exactly where she was going and why, which was information the camp did not yet have the means to interpret correctly. When she did return, she carried something in her arms that changed the reckoning of every claim in that camp. Nobody who saw her cross the flat that evening forgot the weight of it or the stillness of her face. The Gila ran thin in summer and stopped altogether by August. That was the truth every miner in the basin knew, and it was the truth they had built their disdain upon. A dry river, they said, was a played-out river. A woman who bought the alluvial claims along its bone-pale gravel bed was a woman who had spent her last money on a joke. $3.40 at the territorial land auction in Solomonville. That was what Vera paid for 300 feet of dried sand and cracked clay and a few stunted willows that had given up pretending. The auctioneer had knocked it down to her with a single rap of his mallet and a look that bordered on pity. The men on either side of her had laughed quietly, as men will when they believe they are being kind. Vera did not look at them. She folded her receipt and put it inside her coat and walked out into the August heat. She was 26 years old, and she had come to the Gila Basin from Clifton, where her father, Eli Kraus, had worked placer claims and drift tunnels for the better part of 20 years before his lungs gave out the previous spring. He had not left her money. He had left her two things of value: a battered set of folding sieves with bone handles, graduated in 4 mesh sizes from coarse to fine, and an understanding of alluvial geology that he had poured into her over years of walking creek beds at dawn, reading the language of gravel bars and cut banks the way other men read newspapers. She had no brothers. She had no husband. She had the sieves and the knowledge, and she had followed that knowledge south to the Gila because her father had said once, sitting at a camp table with his maps spread flat, that the lower Gila was a river that lied about itself. It hid what it carried. It ran clear and fast in the wet season and deposited in bends and oxbows that a man walking the channel bank would never think to examine, because the gravel looked barren. Looked, he had said, is not the same as is. He had never gotten there himself. She had come in his place. If you have ever bought the thing that everyone around you is certain is worthless, and held your reason close while they laughed, then you understand something of what it costs to walk quietly away from an auction table while the auctioneer shakes his head. Leave a thought below if you do. The encampment at Gila Crossing was a rough settlement of perhaps 40 men, placer miners working the exposed bars upstream, hard rock men sinking shafts into the hills a mile north, and a loose constellation of camp followers, freighters, and opportunists who drifted in and out with the weeks. There was a sutler's tent run by a man named Bright who kept a tobacco barrel and a dry goods shelf, and a handwritten credit ledger. A blacksmith named Orville Petch who had built a permanent stone forge with a proper bellows and a water trough, and a man called Scobie who ran a cot house of 4 bunks and charged $1 a week per man. Women were scarce. Vera was the only one who held a claim of her own. The camp had the particular quality of a place where men had arrived expecting quick results and had stayed longer than they planned, settling into a routine of work and discouragement that had the texture of habit. The upstream bars had been worked before, by a different camp some years earlier, and what remained of them was the second pass material that a thorough first pass had already sorted. Most of the placer men knew this at some level without quite admitting it to themselves, because the alternative was to acknowledge that they had ridden a long way for something that was mostly played out. And a man who acknowledges that has to decide what to do next. It was easier to keep working. Scobie's cot house was always full. Bright's credit ledger had more entries than payments. The men talked about strikes in the way that men in closed systems always talk about what they are waiting for, with a particular mixture of certainty and vagueness, as though the strike was inevitable, but its location and timing were being managed by some external authority they could not quite identify. Vera had seen camps like this before, at her father's side. She understood what the talk meant and what it did not mean, and she did not participate in it. She had arrived 9 days before the auction with her mule, a gray animal named Fitch, and she had spent those 9 days walking the dry Gila bed from the northern edge of her intended claim to the southern terminus and back again. She walked it 3 times through. She carried a long iron rod that her father had bent into a narrow hook at one end, and she probed the gravel at intervals, pushing the hook down through the surface material until she felt the composition change beneath her hand. Gravel changes when you are near a geological structure. Her father had told her that the rod was his best instrument and the most honest. It did not speculate. It did not pretend. It told you what was actually there and expected you to understand what you were being told. The channel was pale and silent under the August sun. The surface gravel bleached to the color of old bone, the willow roots exposed and cracked at the bank edge where the water had retreated. She walked in the channel itself, not on the bank, because the channel floor was where the evidence was, and she did not read it by looking at it. She read it by pressing the rod down through it. There was a specific resistance she was searching for, a point where the rod's easy passage through loose surface material met something denser below, not bedrock, which stopped the rod with a sharp refusal, but the packed compaction of heavy sorted material that had been pressed tight over many years of intermittent high water. Her father had described it as the difference between pushing a fork through light cake and pushing it through something that had been left out to set. She had understood what he meant the first time she had felt it herself, at 11 years old on a bar in the upper Salt River, and she had not forgotten the sensation. She found it on the second full day, at the inside of the southern bend. What the rod told her on the second full day of her walking was that the bend at the southern end of her intended claim held a buried bar of dense material beneath 14 inches of light surface gravel. The surface gravel was the lie. Beneath it, the alluvial concentration that the Gila had been building in that inside bend for an unknown number of high water years sat packed and waiting, never disturbed because no one had thought a dry river worth disturbing. She had bought the claim the following day. She set up her camp on the bank above the dry channel, pitched her canvas lean-to against the only cottonwood of any size on the flat, and unloaded her gear from Fitch's panniers with the deliberate economy of someone who had been doing this since childhood. Her equipment was modest: the graduated sieves, the iron rod, a short-handled pick, 2 flat pans, a canvas water bucket, a folding tin cup, a small leather roll of her father's notes on the lower Gila, written in his cramped hand across the back of old claim forms. She had also brought 30 feet of canvas water pipe and a small hand pump fitted to a metal frame, because moving material in a dry channel required bringing the water to the gravel rather than the gravel to the water. The men of the camp watched her set up without offering to help. That was fine. She was not there for their assistance. The pump drew from a shallow pit she had dug in the lowest corner of her claim, where the water table, even in August, was reachable at 3 feet. It was tepid and slightly silty, but it would move material through a sieve, which was the only thing she needed it to do. On the first day of working, she shoveled the surface gravel aside, exposing the top layer of the buried bar, and ran the first bucket of disturbed material through the coarse sieve. She recovered 2 small flakes, each no larger than a fingernail paring, and a single rounded grain of what her father would have called color of good character, meaning a piece heavy enough and clean enough to suggest the source material was nearby and had not traveled far. She dropped them into her glass vial without expression and went back to shoveling. The camp took notice on the 3rd day when Orville the blacksmith walked the half-mile from his forge to the top of the bank and stood there with his arms folded, watching her work below in the channel. She did not look up. He stood for several minutes and then went back to his forge. That evening, eating her supper at her own fire, she heard the low sound of men talking near the sutler's tent, and once a burst of laughter that had an edge to it. She was used to edges. Her father had been a meticulous man about record-keeping. Every yard of channel he worked, he had logged in a small notebook, the depth of the overburden, the character of the basal material, the yield in grains per yard, the weather conditions. He had done this for 20 years, and the notebooks were a geological library of the streams and rivers he had worked. He had given Vera the 3 that covered the lower Gila, telling her they were worth more than anything else he owned because the knowledge in them was exact. These were not impressions, he had said. These were measurements. The difference between an impression and a measurement is the difference between what you hope is true and what you can prove is true. She had read those notebooks until the pages had softened with handling. By the 5th day, she had exposed the full width of the buried bar and begun working it systematically from north to south, removing material in defined strips 2 feet wide and running each strip through the sieves in sequence from coarse to fine. The yield was climbing. The glass vial had a respectable accumulation of color by the end of that day, and one of the grains was not a flake but a small rounded pellet, what her father had called a shot, the kind of piece that forms in a true depositional trap when gold has been cycling through the same bend year over year for a long time. She turned the vial in the light of her oil lamp that evening and studied what was in it, the way another woman might study a letter. There was more below. She was certain of it. What she had not yet accounted for was the secondary structure her father's notes had mentioned in a single line, written in a different ink than the surrounding text, as if he had added it later. Below the first bar in the Gila's inside bends, watch for a clay lens. If the lens is red, stop and go deeper. The concentration below the lens can exceed what is above it by a factor the surface gives no indication of. She found the clay lens on the morning of the 6th day, at 22 inches below the original surface. It presented itself first as a resistance in the shovel blade, then as a change of color in the disturbed material, from the sandy ochre of the upper gravel to a darker, redder stripe in the section wall. Getting through it required the pick rather than the shovel, and it was work of a different kind from the work above the lens. Not the steady, rhythmic shoveling of loose gravel, but the careful, precise striking required to break hardpan without disturbing the material below it, opening a clean face rather than mixing what she was going to process with what she was trying to get through. Her father had been particular about this. He said a miner who broke into the good layer with a clumsy instrument was a carpenter who split the board he meant to use. The cut had to be clean. She made it clean. It took the better part of that day to open a section wide enough to see what lay beneath. She rested twice and drank from her water tin and ate a piece of camp bread she had brought in her coat pocket. Sitting on the bank above the channel with the pick across her knees and the August heat pressing flat on the white gravel all around her, The camp was quiet at midday. No one came to look. Oh, what lay beneath the lens was gravel of a different character entirely. Darker, heavier, sorted by water action into a tight-packed layer with almost no fine material mixed through it. The geological signature of a high-energy depositional event, a flood year perhaps, that had dropped its heavy load all at once in the shelter of the inside band, and then sealed it with clay in the years that followed. It was the kind of deposit her father had described, but never in the portions of his notes she had read actually found himself. She ran the first pan of that material late in the afternoon with hands that were steady because she had decided they would be. The pan was dark with concentrated material. She worked it down slowly, tilting and swirling and letting the current of the pump water carry the light fines away, tipping the pan at the precise angle her father had demonstrated at Creekside when she was 9 years old, his big hands guiding her smaller ones on the rim. What remained as the lighter material departed was not the faint dusting of color she had grown accustomed to in the days above the clay lens. It was a heavy crescent of gold along the lower edge of the pan, some pieces as small as coarse sand, others the size of apple seeds, and two that were distinctly larger, irregular and rounded and unmistakably what they were. She looked at it for a long time without moving. Then she picked up the vial and tipped the crescent carefully in, added the larger pieces with her fingertip, and recorded the depth, the location within the strip she was working, and the approximate volume of material she had run in the notebook she kept in her coat pocket. She made the entry in the same cramped shorthand her father had used, because that was how she had learned to think about data. She still had perhaps 2 hours of working light. She worked them. Now, if you have ever stood in a dry stream bed and understood that you were the only person who knew what was directly beneath your feet, stay close. What happened next is the part this story has been building toward. By the time Vera Kraus climbed the bank that evening to where Fitch was picketed, her coat pocket held the glass vial, now half full of material she had not weighed, but whose heft she could estimate with fair accuracy from years of handling comparable yields at her father's side. Her arms held the folding sieves, folded and latched as always. Her face held whatever it held, which was not triumph and was not performance. Orville Petch was sitting on a flat rock at the top of the bank where the path came up from the channel. He had apparently been waiting. He was a solid, quiet man of perhaps 50, with a forge-reddened face and the kind of hands that looked like they had been made from a denser material than other men's. He said nothing when she came up the path. He looked at her coat pocket, where the vial made a slight angular shape against the fabric. She stopped and looked at him. He said quietly that he had worked placer ground for 16 years before the forge, and he had seen a woman carry herself the way she was carrying herself exactly once before, and that once had been the day a man named Beaumont had pulled the bottom pan off a bar on the San Pedro and found it black with fine gold. Vera said, "I'm going to need to find a reliable assay in Solomonville, and I'm going to need to record an amendment to my claim to include the subsurface material not specified in the original filing." Orville said that he could drive her to Solomonville in the morning in his wagon if she needed, that his wagon had a lockbox under the seat that she was welcome to use, and that he would tell no one what he had seen until she had made her filings, because he understood that a filing made after word had already spread was a filing made in a different kind of world than the one that existed before. She studied him for a moment, the way she studied everything. "All right," she said. That was the whole of the conversation. She walked to her lean-to, and Orville walked back to his forge, and the camp went about its evening and didn't yet know what it was about to become. She did not sleep well, not from anxiety, but from the kind of wakefulness that comes when the mind is sorting and cataloging and planning, running through the sequence of what must be done in what order, and what the legal instruments required, and what the timeline of it was. She had read enough of her father's accumulated papers, the failed filings, the superseded claims, the disputes that had cost good men their best years, to know that what she had found was not yet hers in any final sense until it was properly and completely documented and filed and witnessed, and beyond the reach of any subsequent claimant who might appear with a competing story about what the ground along that inside bend had actually held. She rose before first light and made a careful inventory of what she would carry to town and what she would leave, and then she made a second inventory of what the vial held, tipping the material carefully onto a sheet of clean paper she had folded into quarters and smoothing it flat under her oil lamp. She counted and sorted and estimated. The flakes she set aside in one group, the shot pieces in another, and the two large irregular pieces she set apart from both, on the clean paper with some space around them, because they were the pieces she had kept returning to mentally during the night and they merited the room. She studied the large pieces for some time, turning the paper to catch the lamp's angle, noting the surface texture and the shape, which told her something about how far they had traveled and what had and had not happened to them along the way. Gold that rounded too much had traveled too far. Gold that was still rough and irregular had a source nearby. These pieces were rough. She weighed it on her father's small hand scale, a pocket instrument in a leather case that she had not yet used on this trip. The reading was not a reading she had expected. She held the scale level and looked at it again, and it told her the same thing. She put the material back into the vial, and the vial into the lockbox in Orville's wagon before he had fully harnessed Fitch's brother among the camp mules. The ride to Solomonville was 2 hours over rough ground, and they did not talk much. What talking there was concerned practical matters. Which assay office she intended to use, and whether the land office would be open by the time they arrived, and what the specific language of a subsurface mineral rights amendment required. Orville knew more about territorial claim law than she had expected, which she noted without comment. In Solomonville, she went first to the assay office of a man named Harker, who was in the business of being precise and who was accustomed to women bringing material to him without male accompaniment, because the territory attracted all kinds, and Harker was not in the business of judgment. He weighed the vial's contents on a calibrated balance, separated the pieces by size class, ran a specific gravity test on the 3 largest pieces, and provided her with a written estimate of value that he signed and dated. She read it twice, standing at his counter. The reading from the pocket scale had not been wrong. She thanked Harker and went directly to the Territorial Land Office and filed an amended claim form that specified subsurface mineral rights to the alluvial material below 15 inches of surface at the inside bend of the southern third of her original claim. Citing the geological character of the deposit in language she had prepared from her father's notes the evening before, the clerk stamped it and gave her a carbon, and she folded it into her coat alongside the assay certificate and the original claim receipt, and walked back out into the street. Orville was sitting in the wagon with his hat pushed back. He raised his eyebrows. "Filed," she said. "How much material you figure is left down there, below that clay?" She said she had opened perhaps 4 feet of the deposit's width, and she estimated it extended another 20 feet to the south before the bend geometry changed, and that if the yield per pan held consistent, she could work it through the autumn and into early winter before the natural water table restoration of the winter rains made pumping easier anyway. Orville was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You gonna work it alone?" "Until I need equipment, I cannot manage alone, yes." He said that when she reached that point, he would like to discuss a business arrangement with her, that he had a set of long-handled sluice boxes in storage from his placer years, and a working knowledge of high-volume alluvial processing, and that he was not looking for a large share, only a fair one, and that she was welcome to decline, and he would drive her home regardless. She said she would consider it. He drove her home. They arrived back at Gila Crossing in the early afternoon, and the camp was at its midday slow, men eating or resting in the thin shade. And Vera stepped down from the wagon with the lockbox under her arm and walked to her lean-to without speaking to anyone. Orville unhitched and said nothing to no one. It was a camp, and camps talk. There was a man named Dews who had seen them leave in the morning and had spent the intervening hours considering what the departure of the quiet woman with the dry river claim meant. And Dews wasn't a man who kept his considerations to himself. By the time the camp was moving again in the late afternoon, the speculation had reached the stage where men were making confident assertions about what they thought was happening on the claimed ground below the cottonwood. Most of those assertions wrong in their specifics, but correct in their general shape, which is how rumor usually works. They saw her come back from the channel that afternoon, carrying the sieves and the pump frame and her tools, and they read the deliberate care of her carrying as the sign it was, because a woman who carried her equipment up from a dry riverbed with that specific kind of attention was a woman who had finished with a piece of ground, not for the day, but for a reckoning. She had pulled what she needed from the deposit for the purposes of proof. The rest would wait. The camp read her movements the way men who live by reading ground will read any significant sign, carefully and with the awareness that they were probably late to the information. By sundown, every man in the camp understood that something had been found in the dry Gila bed, on the claimed ground below the old cottonwood, something the woman from Clifton with her dead father's sieves had known was there before she had paid $3.40 for the right to look for it. The discussions that evening around the various fires were practical and recalibrating. Men who had laughed at the auction table were not laughing now, and those men were smart enough not to pretend they had not laughed, because she was still in the camp and she had a good memory, and she was not the sort who forgot. She sat at her own fire with Orville, who had brought his camp chair, and they ate salt pork and camp bread and drank coffee, and she showed him her father's 3 notebooks on the lower Gila, not the entries about this claim, but the general methodology sections, the passages where Eli Krauss had described how to read alluvial geometry, and why inside bends in low-gradient channels were the correct places to look for multi-cycle depositional traps. Orville read slowly, in the manner of a man who gives words the same gravity he gives iron. Around them the camp sounds continued, the clank of a tent pole, the low exchange of voices, a horse moving at the picket line, and none of it reached them because what was in the notebooks required the kind of attention that closes out peripheral sound. Vera drank her coffee and watched the fire and did not explain anything while he read. The notebooks did not require explanation. That had been true of them from the beginning. He said after a while that her father had known things that most placer men never learned. He spent 20 years learning them, she said, and then he gave them to me, because there was no one else to give them to. Orville closed the notebook and handed it back and said, "That was a considerable inheritance." She put the notebook into her coat and looked at the fire. "Yes," she said, "it is." The amendment was filed. The assay certificate was witnessed. The material in the glass vial was weighed and logged and was now the first physical account of what the lower Gila's inside bend at the southern end of her claim had been collecting in its silence for longer than anyone then living could calculate. The claim, which had been purchased as a joke, was now a matter of record in Solomonville, annotated and specific, and no subsequent claimant could reach it without reaching through the paper she had put in front of it. There was a man named Aldrich who held the claims immediately north and south of hers, who had been among the first to laugh at the auction table and who had since been working a hard rock shaft in the hillside north of the camp with modest returns. He came to her fire that evening, uninvited but not unwelcome, and stood at the edge of the firelight and said that he understood there had been some development on her ground. She looked at him. "There has," she said. He said that he had been thinking about the geological character of the flats along the Gila, and that it seemed to him possible that the kind of material she had found might extend across the boundary into his adjacent ground, and he wondered whether she had any views on the subject. She said she had spent 9 days walking the full extent of the channel before she had bid on her specific claim, and that in her assessment, the depositional geometry was specific to the inside bend structure within her claim and did not have the same character in the adjacent ground. She said this clearly and without particular emphasis because it was her assessment and she had made it carefully, and it was not her habit to soften a precise observation. Aldrich stood there for a moment. "Your father teach you all that," he said. "He did," she said. "And I listened." He nodded once and walked back to his own fire, and that was that. The autumn season on the Gila that year became a methodical one for her. She worked the deposit in strips, maintained her records in the small notebook, ran her material through the sieves in proper sequence, and logged every yield against the section she had worked so that she was building a complete picture of the deposit's character and extent, rather than simply extracting from it without map or measurement. Her father had told her that a deposit worked without records was a deposit only half understood, and that a miner who did not understand what he had found could not know when he had found all of it, which meant he might leave the most valuable section untouched while believing he was finished. The weather in September and into October was cooperative. The desert cold coming in at night, but the days still workable. The light long and angled and good for reading the material in the pan. She was in the channel by first light each morning and out before dark, and the glass vials she had brought in the small tin box inside her left pannier were filling one by one, each labeled in pencil with the date and the section number. She kept the box in the lockbox in Orville's forge when she was not working, a fact that Orville had suggested without being asked, and that she had accepted as a practical measure, and nothing more. She was not going to leave anything untouched without knowing she was leaving it. Orville's sluice boxes went into service in mid-September, when the volume of material she had ready to process exceeded what the hand sieve method could turn over in a reasonable working day. He had been right about the arrangement being fair. He asked for 12% of the yield on material, processed with his equipment and his labor, and he put that agreement in writing in a document that she drafted and that both of them signed in front of the clerk at the camp sutler's tent, who was willing to witness a business document for 50 cents. The sutler had said when he read it over that it was tighter language than most mining partnerships he had witnessed, and Vera said that was because she had written it rather than having someone else write it for her. The deposit ran for 61 feet below the clay lens before the gravel changed character and the yield dropped to the level of the surface material above, which told her she had found the full extent of the depositional trap. She had been correct about the bend geometry. She had measured it exactly right. The total yield from that season was weighed and valued in Solomonville in early December, when the winter rains had begun and the Gila was running again, thin and pale along its gravel bed, quiet about what it had given up. Harker did the final accounting with the same calm precision he had applied to the initial assay, setting each category of material on its own tray and working through the weights methodically, his pen moving in small, neat figures in his ledger. He had been in the assay business for 11 years, and his expressions did not tend toward the dramatic, but when he totaled the column and looked up at her, there was something in his face that was not quite his usual composure. He verified the calculation twice before he presented the final certificate. The value was not a fortune in the sense of making her wealthy, in the way the word is used loosely. It was substantial. It was, precisely, enough to buy a piece of deeded land in Clifton, near her father's old camp, with a house already on it, and to pay for the equipment she would need to work 2 or 3 other claims she had identified in her father's notebooks as possessing the same kind of hidden depositional structure that the Gila had held. She paid Orville his 12% in cash on the day of the final accounting at Harker's assay office, with Harker present as witness. Orville counted it and put it in his coat and said she had been a square partner. She said he had done the same. That was the end of it between them, in terms of business. She bought him coffee before the drive back, and they sat in the office of a small restaurant in Solomonville and talked for an hour about the lower Gila's remaining unclaimed ground, which she had examined at length during her initial walking survey, and which she thought had 3 additional inside bends worth investigating, none of them currently held. Orville said he knew a man who had worked the area for 6 months in the 70s and come away with nothing and given up. And she said that was because a man who had not read an alluvial deposit correctly was a man who had been looking at the wrong part of the river. She paid for the coffee and they drove back to the camp. The camp at Gila Crossing wound down in the winter as camps do, and by February of 1884, it had shed perhaps half its population to other claims elsewhere in the territory, or to town life, or to the general wandering that took men from one played-out prospect to the next. She was not among those who left for lack of results. She left because she had gotten what she came for and had 3 more places to be. She loaded her gear onto Fitch with the same deliberate economy with which she had unloaded it the previous August, strapping the panniers in the order her father had taught her, so the weight distributed correctly and the animal did not fatigue unevenly on a long walk. The folding sieves went in last, latched and wrapped in canvas, the bone handles worn smooth from her father's years of handling, and then her own. She had never replaced them. She had no intention of replacing them. There was a particular quality to the light in the Gila Basin in early winter, a flat, pale quality that came from the low sun angle and the absence of the summer's dust. And the river itself was different now, running thin and clear along the channel. It had been silent in when she arrived, the water colorless and cold, and carrying a trace smell of upstream mineral that reached the nose before the sound of the water did. She stopped at the bank above the inside bend before she reached the road and looked down at the channel, and the gravel of the worked section was rinsed clean and pale, indistinguishable from the surface gravel of the unwrought bars upstream. The river covered what it had given up. It would have covered it again in any case, that winter, with a new layer of material carried down from the hills. In 20 years there might be a new depositional trap forming above the one she had worked out. She put that in the back of her mind as a practical observation, noted without attachment. Orville was at his forge when she brought Fitch past on the road north. He raised a hand. She raised a hand in return. Neither of them spoke because everything relevant had already been said in the proper places at the proper times, and speech that only restates what is already understood is a kind of waste. The road north to Clifton ran along the edge of the dry flats before climbing into the higher country, and she walked it beside Fitch in the early morning cold, with her red shawl pulled close, the desert on her right and the foothills rising on her left, and the road empty and straight ahead. The river was behind her, running its thin winter course over the gravel of the inside bend that had held its secret for decades until the right person had known how to ask it the right question. The 3 notebooks of Eli Krauss rode in the left side pannier against Fitch's flank, wrapped in oilcloth. She had not asked the river to give her anything. She had only demonstrated that she already knew what was there, and the river had not been in a position to deny it. That is the only kind of luck she had ever believed in. If there is a story like this one that you want to stay with, there are more waiting in this same country, about the women who rad the ground that others walked over and found what no one else thought to look for. This is a place where the evidence always outlasts the dismissal.